The question comes, what is an excellent company? And to my mind, an excellent company or excellent business or excellent institution is one that has done well enough for long enough. The problem is, many well enough organizations do not last long enough. Many of those who last long enough do not do well enough. And therefore, the spirit of true excellence is when you do well enough and you do it for long enough. And perhaps, you should be proud in SAMBAD that you have been epitomizing some of that for having done long enough and well enough. I was a student when the first edition perhaps came up. Today I'm at the end of my professional career, and I still find the institution is thriving, surviving, and growing. The question is, a lot of the time we define excellent organizations, particularly business organizations, by how much of shareholder return they have created. What is the return on capital employed? We judge it by how many people they employed. What's the net worth? But what is important we often forget is that most value embedded in an organization is not in its physical assets, but in its intangible assets. Call it the values, call it the culture, call it the people, call it the competence, call it the brands. Many of the time when mergers and acquisitions happen, those of you who are more connected with business would realize that in mergers and acquisitions, in balance sheet, there is always an entry called goodwill. And goodwill is nothing but that embedded intangible that is there in the organization, which often in many organizations consists of brands and equivalent. But one of the mistakes that we could make in Odisha, or for that matter many global corporations make, is that they do not think that it is, or rather they make the mistake of thinking that it is always easy to do well enough for long enough. And that is how, if you go back to the famous work of Tom Peters and Waterman about In Search of Excellence, where they studied 43 of Fortune 500 companies that were, in their assessment, were doing exceptionally well, somewhere in early 90s. Out of that, 20% don't exist today, 33% are struggling, and the rest have obviously sustained. Similarly, another great author, Jim Collins, wrote 2 books. One is somewhere in 2006, which was called Good to Great, and the another book he wrote called Built to Last. All of them tried to study, interestingly, that what makes a great company, and do they sustain, and what makes them sustain. But a very interesting research by certain Harvard researchers that published an article, they studied the financial performance from 1966 till 2010, 1966 to 2010, of 25,000 US companies to find out, and they categorize companies into 2 categories called miracle workers and long runners. They sell all those who are in the top 10% of return on assets, they call them as miracle workers. And those who delivered return on assets between 20 to 40% in that 25,000 number of companies, they call them long runners. And they found that between those who delivered higher return on their assets, there were 2 distinguishing characteristics. First is better than cheaper, which means that you need to have a differentiation strategy. And second was revenue over cost. Many times, we find that many companies go on doing cost cutting, and don't misunderstand me. It is important to cut costs to be competitive. But costs can be cut only to that point. So revenue has to be a primary driver of your excellence, and we got to find an interesting way to drive revenue.